Most every artist spends his entire life or her entire life solving the first 10 years of his or her life.
I want to open up some bigger projects that I worked on just to show you what went into them and maybe give some rationale for why I made my choices and see if those choices help you out in your own creative projects. This particular one has a Sphinx character that's flying through the clouds. It looks kind of like How to Train Your Dragon, kind of toothless character. It's actually taken from Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. I began this one in the flipbook. I did these very quick gestural drawings because in the olden days, this is really how animation was done, frame by frame, but also with these super quick animatics, usually by the directors. People like Chuck Jones and Fritz Freeling would do the key frames, and I'm talking about the legitimate keyframes, not the modern digital animation term keyframes, but they would do the key moments of the cartoons they were working on, and then they had their subordinates do the in-between bits where character moves from space to space, just copying the style of the head animator. This particular flipbook really is just scribbles, but it was important scribbles. It was getting out the timing of my piece, and it was getting out the basics of where arms, legs, head, wings would be. And it was so helpful to work this way. It's not a way that I particularly am used to working because I like the fact that Procreate can go straight to inks and then I can back up and erase when I make a mistake. So this, in a way, felt like it was very time-consuming and lengthy. It certainly wasn't time-consuming to put my scribbles down. In fact, it actually was kind of a confidence booster because I could start to visualize what was happening, and I think my animation was a lot more fluid working this way rather than when I'm trying to do my good drawings, quote-unquote good drawings, I should say, my professional drawings with the ink outlines and the color in it. In this case, it was a very fluid set of scribbles, and since you can't move the bottom layer of your flipbook layers anyways, you might as well make it a scribble pad. You can easily turn off this visibility once you start adding your color and your ink outline layers and your effects and all the other things that you want to pile on top of your character. So my next step is to create 2 new layers. I know the very top layer is going to be my ink outline on my character, my black details, and then this layer that's empty, that doesn't have the scribble or my ink outlines on it, is going to be color. I might create other layers in between. Anything above your bottom background layer, you can create new layers, reorganize them. Ultimately, what ended up happening was I had a top layer that was the ink details. I had a next layer which had motion lines for the wings. I had another layer which was color. And then my bottom layer, which was my sketch scribble, I just turned that off. I just turned off the opacity, the visibility of those. They still remained, but they're turned off. And I had a fluid character that, as I grouped the frames, I did incisions in certain parts of the group and looped those segments that I thought could be stretched out, or it made sense that the character would glide a little bit longer, which was my original intent. When I did these drawings, it's just when you do your flipbook drawings and then you go back and watch it, very frequently you'll see this stuff moves way faster than I intended it to move. And that's okay, because in your flipbook, you can add additional frames. You'll see the onion skin, purple being your previous frame and yellow being the next frame. And you can make your in-between animations accordingly. You're almost always going to get a very fast animation when you do a flipbook, and then you'll go back and look at it and say, oh man, that thing went just way too fast. That character walked way too fast towards the sea. Gotta slow it down. And unfortunately, Procreate Dreams does not have a speed duration sort of manipulation tool, but you can always add frames in this frame by frame tool. So once I've grouped my frames of my Sphinx character, and then, as I said, I cut them up and duplicated what I thought needed duplicating. I went ahead and grouped those again. So now I have this one long track that is all the groupings, including parts that I've cut up, reorganized, copied, duplicated, so on and so forth. Now, this group is everything that is my character, and now I can use the performance recording tool, which means I can scale my character, I can move them around, I can rotate them, and in the course of their flight, This made the animation even more dynamic looking, even though I didn't do it in sort of the three-dimensional camera style where you could like pan underneath a body and go and check out the front of the face. I think that was my original intent when I was doing my drawings, but ultimately I felt like I really wanted to sort of stick behind the character instead of acting like a drone camera and flying around and seeing the character's face. I can do another shot where I see that character's face. I love doing background layers in Procreate Dreams. Backgrounds are usually very hard for me to illustrate. I think like a lot of people, I'm more drawn to working with characters and living beings than doing landscapes and flora and fauna. That stuff just isn't as exciting for somebody who's into the emotional weight of stories. But of course, your backgrounds can carry emotional weight, and I think people who pay good attention to their backgrounds and the details of them, you know, that really enhances their storytelling and makes their setting have a lot more verisimilitude, meaning believability and reality to them. So thankfully, Procreate allows you to import all sorts of amazing watercolor, elemental, liquid, cloud, light, and so on and so forth. So I had an entire day that I spent gathering these tools. I made my cloud layers, and then because I did want this to have a little bit of an anime manga feel to it, utilize some screen tone effects, some zoom lines that you'd see in a typical manga or anime. Because this character is representative of death in Pinocchio, I wanted them to be zooming towards a light. So I created my cloud layers, and as the character zoomed through them, I cut the track, placed a track of clouds above my zooming character, and then had that opacity reduced, put on some Gaussian blur as it came towards the camera as if we were flying through the cloud as well behind the Sphinx. Faded in the speed lines, used the performance capture aspect of Procreate Dreams to make this single drawing of speed lines jittery and rotate around, and then ultimately created some frames of black blobs that grew and grew until my character, in theory, entered them. And I might make these white in the end, because if you're headed towards the afterlife, it's supposed to be a white light that's coming. But that's the basics of this animation. It took a few days because mainly I had to repetitively redraw, color each individual frame on the flipbook, but I really enjoyed the process. Quite honestly, it turned out a lot better than I imagined it would in the beginning. I did save myself some time by creating a texture loop. These are the dots and the sort of rustic textures that go on top of my Sphinx character. These were just 4 or 5 frames that I had going in sequence, grouped them, duplicated until I could group them again, and then layered them on top of my Sphinx character. It made the character look and feel a lot nicer, even though it isn't sort of like traditional shading. It isn't consistent shading or textures over the wings. I know in the film, I believe the character has eyeballs on the wings, much like the Death character in Hellboy 2, but it is consistent with my style. My artistic style, which involves a lot of collage elements, cut up elements, things that filter in and out and aren't necessarily like representational of reality. So I was happy with my texture loop. Without the texture loop, the character did look very, very cartoony in a very basic way. And yeah, it's kind of up to you what sort of style you want for your animation. One of my favorite things about the modern era is that we can apply textures like construction paper, cardboard, old magazines, old newspapers, rust, debris, any sort of thing that just kind of adds another dimension to our artwork, and it takes it beyond the very flat illustrator look. I'm not a big fan of things that are consistently normal textures and don't have any real-world grit moving around on them. I like things that feel a little more messy and lived in, and I feel like that is a result of coming up in the era, having watched Star Wars since birth, where everything has a lived-in atmosphere to it. Thanks for watching. Make sure you check out my full 78-minute course on Procreate Dreams. The link is below. Best of luck to you in all your creative endeavors.